It was June. The year was 323 BCE. The city was Babylon. Inside the palace, the air was thick and heavy. The smell of burning incense mixed with the scent of sweat and medicine. Alexander the Great was dying. He was only 32 years old. He had conquered almost everything from Greece to India. He had never lost a battle. But now, a simple fever was doing what no army could. Outside the bedroom doors, his generals were waiting. They were the most powerful men in the world. They were also the most dangerous. They were already looking at each other and wondering who would take the crown. The doctors had given up. Alexander had lost his voice days ago. His soldiers were allowed to walk past his bed one last time to say goodbye. They cried as they saw the man who had led them across the world, looking so small and pale. He almost died that night. In our history books, that is exactly what happened. He died in the heat of Babylon. His empire was ripped apart by his generals. The world changed forever because he was gone. But in this story, the fever does not win. In this story, the man who refused to lose a battle refuses to lose to a ghost. The sun rose over the river the next morning. The generals were prepared to hear the announcement of his death. Instead, they heard a sound from inside the room. It was the sound of a cup hitting the floor. Alexander was awake. His eyes were clear for the first time in weeks. He was weak, but he was alive. And he was angry. For the next few months, the world held its breath. Alexander did not go back to his old life of drinking and feasting. The near-death experience had changed him. He felt like his work was unfinished. He had conquered the East. He had seen the edge of the world. In India, he had taken the gold of Persia and the temples of Egypt. But when he looked at his maps, he saw a massive, empty space. He looked toward the west. He looked toward the Mediterranean Sea. He looked toward the wild lands of Europe. At that time, Europe was not the center of the world. Greece was famous, of course. But beyond Greece, the continent was seen as a land of barbarians and shadows. There was a city called Carthage in North Africa that was rich and powerful. There was a small town in Italy called Rome that was starting to grow. But to Alexander, these were just targets. He had already drawn up the plans before he got sick. He wanted to build 1,000 warships. He wanted to build a road that stretched across the entire coast of Africa. He wanted to build a tomb for his father that would be bigger than the pyramids. His generals tried to talk him out of it. They were tired. They had been away from home for 10 years. They had more money and power than they knew what to do with. They wanted to go back to their villas and enjoy their riches. Alexander didn't care about their comfort. He didn't care about his own comfort. He believed he was the son of a god, and gods do not stop because they are tired. He gave the order. The shipyards in Phoenicia and Cyprus began to work day and night. Timber was cut from the mountains. Thousands of workers were brought in to build a fleet the world had never seen. He wasn't just building a navy, he was building a floating city. These ships were designed to carry thousands of horses and tens of thousands of men. They were designed to stay at sea for months. By the time he was 34, the fleet was ready. He stood on the docks and looked out at the water. In our world, the Greek influence spread east into Asia. In this world, Alexander was about to turn the tide. He turned his back on the deserts of the east. He pointed his sword toward the sunset. The conquest of Europe was about to begin. It was June. The year was 323 BCE. The city was Babylon. Inside the palace, the air was thick and heavy. The smell of burning incense mixed with the scent of sweat and medicine. Alexander the Great was dying. He was only 32 years old. He had conquered almost everything from Greece to India. He had never lost a battle. But now, a simple fever was doing what no army could. Outside the bedroom doors, his generals were waiting. They were the most powerful men in the world. They were also the most dangerous. They were already looking at each other and wondering who would take the crown. The doctors had given up. Alexander had lost his voice days ago. His soldiers were allowed to walk past his bed one last time to say goodbye. They cried as they saw the man who had led them across the world looking so small and pale. He almost died that night. In our history books, that is exactly what happened. He died in the heat of Babylon. His empire was ripped apart by his generals. The world changed forever because he was gone. But in this story, The fever does not win. In this story, the man who refused to lose a battle refuses to lose to a ghost. The sun rose over the river the next morning. The generals were prepared to hear the announcement of his death. Instead, they heard a sound from inside the room. It was the sound of a cup hitting the floor. Alexander was awake. His eyes were clear for the first time in weeks. He was weak, but he was alive. And he was angry. For the next few months, the world held its breath. The near-death experience had changed him. Alexander did not go back to his old life of drinking and feasting. He felt like his work was unfinished. He had conquered the East. He had seen the edge of the world in India. He had taken the gold of Persia and the temples of Egypt. But when he looked at his maps, he saw a massive, empty space. He looked toward the west. He looked toward the Mediterranean Sea. He looked toward the wild lands of Europe. At that time, Europe was not the center of the world. Greece was famous, of course. But beyond Greece, the continent was seen as a land of barbarians and shadows. There was a city called Carthage in North Africa that was rich and powerful. There was a small town in Italy called Rome that was starting to grow. But to Alexander, these were just targets. He had already drawn up the plans before he got sick. He wanted to build 1,000 warships. He wanted to build a road that stretched across the entire coast of Africa. His generals tried to talk him out of it. He wanted to build a tomb for his father that would be bigger than the pyramids. They were tired. They had been away from home for 10 years. They had more money and power than they knew what to do with. They wanted to go back to their villas and enjoy their riches. Alexander didn't care about their comfort. He didn't care about his own comfort. He believed he was the son of a god. And gods do not stop because they are tired. He gave the order. The shipyards in Phoenicia and Cyprus began to work day and night. Timber was cut from the mountains. Thousands of workers were brought in to build a fleet the world had never seen. He wasn't just building a navy. He was building a floating city. They were designed to stay at sea for months. These ships were designed to carry thousands of horses and tens of thousands of men. By the time he was 34, the fleet was ready. He stood on the docks and looked out at the water. In our world, the Greek influence spread east into Asia. In this world, Alexander was about to turn the tide. He turned his back on the deserts of the east. He pointed his sword toward the sunset. The conquest of Europe was about to begin. The walls of Carthage were the strongest in the world. They were 30 feet high and almost 30 feet thick. Inside those walls, the city was a maze of markets and temples. The Carthaginians were not just rich. They were masters of the sea. They had spent hundreds of years building a trade network that stretched from the coast of Africa to the islands of Britain. In our history, Carthage would eventually become the greatest enemy of Rome. They would fight 3 massive wars that lasted over 100 years. But in this story, Rome is still a small, local power in Italy. Carthage is the only thing standing in Alexander's way. Alexander did not arrive with a message of peace. He arrived with 1,000 ships and his veteran army. The Carthaginians thought they were safe because of their harbor. They had a secret inner port that could hold 220 warships. They had massive chains that could block the entrance. They believed no one could get inside. But Alexander had a memory of a city called Tyre. Years ago, when he was conquering the East, Tyre had resisted him. Tyre was an island city with walls just as strong as Carthage. Alexander didn't just sail around them. He built a bridge through the sea. He turned an island into a peninsula. When he saw the harbor of Carthage, he didn't see an impossible defense. He saw a construction project. He ordered his engineers to begin building massive siege towers on the decks of his ships. He brought in thousands of local workers from the surrounding desert. He was not just attacking a city. He was rearranging the landscape. The siege lasted for 6 months. The Carthaginian navy tried to break out. They fought with a desperation that the Persians never had. They were fighting for their homes and their families. But they were fighting against a man who had forgotten how to fail. Alexander was on the front lines every day. He was in his 30s now, but he still fought like a teenager. He was the first man up the ladders. He was the first man to leap onto the enemy walls. His soldiers saw this and believed he was truly a god. If their king was immortal, then they were immortal too. One night, the engineers finished a massive stone mole that blocked the Carthaginian harbor completely. The greatest navy in the West was trapped. Their ships had no room to move. Their sailors had no way to use their skills. The city was cut off from the sea that had made them rich. When the walls finally broke, it was not a battle. It was an execution. Alexander did not want a city that would rebel later. He wanted a lesson for the rest of the West. He wanted every king in Italy and every tribe in Spain to know what happened to those who said no to him. The wealth of Carthage was put onto Alexander's ships. The gold, the silver, and the thousands of slaves were sent back to Babylon and Macedonia. The city itself was not destroyed, but it was changed. It became a Macedonian base. The Carthaginian language was replaced with Greek. The Carthaginian gods were replaced with the gods of Olympus. With Carthage gone, the gate to the western Mediterranean was wide open. Alexander looked north. He looked toward the boot-shaped peninsula of Italy. He had heard rumors of a city there that was famous for its disciplined soldiers. He had heard of a people called the Romans. In our world, Rome was the future. In this world, Rome was just the next target on Alexander's list. He gave the order to prepare the fleet for a short voyage. He told his men they would spend the winter in the hills of Italy. The most famous army in history was about to meet the most disciplined army in history. The Phalanx was about to meet the Legion. The world was about to see which way the future would go. After the fall of Carthage, Alexander did not sail back to the east. He turned his ships north. He was heading toward the long peninsula of Italy. At this time, Italy was not a single country. It was a collection of different tribes and small cities. The most important of these was a city called Rome. In our history, Rome would go on to rule the world for hundreds of years. But in this moment, they were just starting to grow. They were a republic, which meant they didn't have a king. They were ruled by a group of elders called the Senate. And they were famous for one thing: they never gave up. Alexander had heard stories about these people. He had heard that they were disciplined and that they lived simple lives. He had heard that they were better at building and organizing than the Greeks were. He wanted to see if they were as good at fighting as people said. The Romans were not like the Persians. When Alexander fought the Persians, he just had to find the king. If he could capture or kill the king, the whole empire would fall apart. But the Romans had no king. If you killed one leader, they would just vote for another one the next morning. They didn't fight for a man. They fought for their city. Alexander landed his army on the southern coast of Italy. He brought 30,000 of his most experienced soldiers. These were men who had survived the deserts of Asia and the mountains of India. He also brought his war elephants. The people of Italy had never seen an animal that large before. They called them Lucanian cows because they didn't have a word for elephant. The Roman Senate did not panic. They didn't send messengers with gold to try and buy Alexander off. Instead, they called up every man who was old enough to carry a sword. They told their people that a foreign invader had arrived on their soil. They said that the life of the Republic was at stake. The two armies met in a valley a few days' march from Rome. On one side was the Macedonian Phalanx. This was a wall of men carrying spears that were 20 feet long. They stood so close together that their shields overlapped. It was like a forest of iron moving toward you. Nothing had ever been able to stop it. On the other side were the Roman legions. The Romans didn't use long spears. They used short, heavy swords and large rectangular shields. They fought in smaller groups that were more flexible. If one group was pushed back, another could move in to fill the gap. The battle lasted all day. Alexander was in the middle of the fighting, as he always was. He led his cavalry in a charge meant to break the Roman lines. But the Romans didn't break. They would retreat a few steps, regroup, and then push back. They fought with a stubbornness that Alexander had never seen before. Even when the elephants charged, the Romans found a way. They used their javelins to hit the elephants in the eyes and the trunks. The giant animals panicked and turned back toward Alexander's own men. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw his own soldiers start to look afraid, but Alexander was still a genius of war. He saw a small opening in the Roman center. He gathered his personal guards and rode straight into the gap. He managed to get behind the Roman lines and cause enough chaos to win the day. The Romans were forced to retreat back toward their city. Alexander had won the battle, but as he walked across the field that night, he wasn't celebrating. He realized he had lost. More men in one day against the Romans than he had in months against the Persians. He realized that every time he killed a Roman soldier, there were 10 more waiting to take his place. He sent a messenger to the Roman Senate. He offered them a choice. They could become his allies and keep their laws, but they had to pay him taxes. The Senate's answer was short. They told the messenger that they would not talk about peace as long as one foreign soldier remained on Italian soil. Alexander was shocked. He had conquered the greatest empire in the world, and the Persians had bowed to him. But this small city in Italy was telling him no. He realized that if he wanted to rule Europe, he would have to do more than just win battles. He would have to break the spirit of a people who refused to be broken. He gave the order to march toward Rome. He told his generals that this would be the greatest siege of their lives. He didn't know it yet, but the city he was about to attack would change the way he looked at his own empire. Alexander did not attack the city of Rome right away. He chose to wait. He set up his camp. He set up his camp in the hills overlooking the city and cut off all the roads. He stopped the grain from coming in from the farms. He wanted to see if the Roman spirit would break when their stomachs were empty. The siege lasted for months. Inside the walls, the Romans did. Something that surprised the Macedonian generals. They did not fight over the little food they had, they shared it. The richest leaders ate the same small pieces of bread as the poorest workers. They believed that if they held out long enough, Alexander would get bored and leave. But Alexander was not getting bored. He was watching. He spent his days studying the way the Romans had built their walls and their sewers. He was impressed by their discipline. He realized that these were not just barbarians who happened to be good at fighting. These were people who knew how to build a society that could last. Eventually, his engineers found a weak spot in the Roman defenses. They used their giant wooden machines to smash through a section of the wall. The Macedonian soldiers prepared for a bloodbath. They expected to spend the night burning the city and taking everything they could carry. But Alexander gave a very strange order. He told his men that no house was to be burned. He said that no woman or child was to be harmed. He wanted the city of Rome to stay exactly as it was. He didn't want to destroy it. He wanted to own it. The next morning, Alexander walked into the Roman Senate house alone. He did not bring his guards. He did not wear his purple cape or his golden helmet. He sat down on a wooden bench among the Roman elders. He didn't speak to them like a conqueror. He spoke to them like a businessman. He told them that he had more gold than they could imagine. He told them he had an army that could never be defeated. But he also admitted something. He told them that his own people, the Greeks, were better at fighting than they were at ruling. The Greeks were always arguing and starting civil wars. Alexander offered the Romans a deal. He told them they could keep their senate. They could keep their own laws and their own religion. But in exchange, they would become the managers of his new empire in the West. He wanted the Romans to be the ones who built the roads and collected the taxes. He wanted the military power of Greece to be joined with the organizational power of Rome. The Roman leaders were practical men. They looked at the thousands of soldiers outside their doors. They looked at their empty grain stores. They realized that if they said no, their city would die. If they said yes, they would become part of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. They took the deal. This was the moment that changed the history of Europe forever. In our world, Rome and Greece were two different chapters of history. In this world, they became one single force. The world had never seen anything like it. With Italy now on his side, Alexander turned his eyes further west. He looked toward the lands we now call France and Spain. At that time, these places were filled with thousands of different tribes. They were brave fighters, but they were not organized. They had no central king and no massive cities to defend. Alexander did not try to conquer them all with his sword. He used the Roman method. He sent Roman engineers ahead of his army. They built a massive stone road that stretched from Italy all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Every few miles, they built a small fort and a marketplace. He told the tribes that if they used his roads and traded in his markets, they could stay in peace. He told them they could keep their traditions as long as they learned to speak Greek. Bit by bit, the wildlands of Europe began to look like the cities of the East. Temples to the Greek gods were built in the forests of France. Schools teaching Greek philosophy were opened in the hills of Spain. Alexander was no longer just a king of Macedonia or a king of Persia. He was becoming something new. He was becoming the first emperor of Europe. He decided that he needed a new home. Babylon was too far to the east. Greece was too small. He looked at the map and found a spot on the coast of what we now call France. He ordered the builders to start working on a new city. He wanted it to be the greatest capital the world had ever seen. A city that would connect the cold lands of the north with the warm waters of the Mediterranean. The era of the European Empire had begun, and at the center of it all was a man who refused to let his story end in a sickbed in Babylon. Alexander knew that an empire this big could not be ruled from a tent. It could not be ruled from a city. On the edge of the world, like Babylon, he needed a new heart for his new world. He needed a place that looked toward the future. He chose a spot at the mouth of a great river in the land we now call France. At the time, it was just a marshy coast, but Alexander saw a city. He called it Alexandria on the Rhone. It was the 17th city he had named after himself, but this one was different. This was not a military fort. It was designed to be the greatest port in human history. He brought in the best architects from Greece. He brought in the best stonecutters from Egypt. He brought in the Roman engineers he had just hired. The city was built on a grid. The streets were wide enough for 6 chariots to drive side by side. Under the streets, the Romans built a system of sewers that kept the city clean and healthy. Nothing like this existed anywhere else in Europe. At the center of the city, he did something that no one expected. He built a library. But it wasn't just for Greek books. He ordered his scouts to collect the stories and the laws of the Celtic tribes. He wanted to know how the people of the north lived. He wanted to know what they believed. He believed that if he could teach a man to read and write, he wouldn't have to fight him. He opened schools where the sons of tribal chiefs sat next to the sons of Greek generals. They all wore the same tunics. They all spoke the same language. Within one generation, the leaders of the barbarian tribes were thinking like Greeks. They weren't just learning philosophy. They were learning how to build. Alexander sent these young men back to their homes in the deep forests. He gave them the tools and the gold to build their own cities. He told them to build theaters. He told them to build marketplaces. He told them to build bathhouses. Slowly, the map of Europe began to change. The dark forests were being cleared to make way for farms. The small wooden villages were being replaced by stone towns. For the first time, people from the mountains of Spain could trade with people from the islands of Greece. They used the same coins. They followed the same laws. They felt like they belonged to something bigger than their own tribe. Alexander was creating a new kind of person. He wasn't just a Macedonian or a Roman or a Celt. He was a citizen of the empire. This was a radical idea. In the old world, you were only loyal to your family or your village. Alexander wanted them to be loyal to a dream. But while the cities were rising, the king was aging. Alexander was now in his late 30s. His body was covered in scars from a dozen different wars. He had survived the fever in Babylon, but he was not young anymore. He spent his days in the new palace, looking at maps of the north. He looked at the land of the Germans. He looked at the mysterious islands across the sea that we now call Britain. He wondered if he had enough time left to reach the very end of the continent. He wondered if the peace he had built would last after he was gone. His generals were worried. They saw that the king was obsessed with the north. He was planning an expedition into the deep, cold forests, beyond the great rivers. The soldiers were starting to whisper. They had everything they wanted now. They had villas, they had wealth, and they had a peaceful land to live in. They didn't want to march into the cold and the dark. Alexander didn't care about their comfort. He believed his life was a race against time. He felt that if he stopped moving, the empire would fall apart. He thought that a king who isn't winning is a king who is dying. He gave the order for the army to gather at the northern border. He wanted to see the land where the sun never sets in the summer. He wanted to reach the edge of the world in the west, just as he had in the east. But as he prepared for this final march, a new threat was growing. It wasn't an army. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a secret. that his closest friends were keeping from him. The empire was becoming too big for one man to hold, and some of those friends were starting to think that the empire might be better off without its king. The deal with the Romans worked better than anyone expected. The Romans were not like the Greeks. The Greeks spent their time talking about art and philosophy. The Romans spent their time counting bags of grain and measuring the width of roads. Alexander realized he had found the perfect partners. He was the vision. They were the machine. But this partnership came with a heavy price for the people of Rome. They were the machine. But this partnership came with a heavy price for the people of Rome. Before Alexander arrived, Rome was a republic. The citizens believed they were free. They believed that no one man should ever have all the power. They had a deep, ancient hatred for the word king. Now, they had a king who lived in a palace made of marble and gold. The Roman Senate still met every day. They still wore their white robes. They still debated the laws of the city. But everyone knew the truth. The real decisions were not being made in the Senate house. They were being made in Alexander's private office. Slowly, the spirit of the Republic began to fade. The Roman leaders realized that being part of an empire was much more profitable than being part of a small city-state. They were no longer just ruling a few hills in Italy. They were the managers of a continent. They were getting rich from the silver mines in Spain and the horse trade in Gaul. Greed began to replace duty. The old Roman virtues of living a simple life and serving the state were forgotten. The young Roman nobles didn't want to work on their family farms anymore. They wanted to be governors in far-off provinces. They wanted to live like the Greek princes they saw in Alexander's court. This was the end of the Roman Republic. In our world, the Republic lasted for nearly 500 years. It died slowly after long civil wars. In this world, it died with a handshake and a tax agreement. The idea that citizens could govern themselves was replaced by the idea of an efficient empire. Alexander saw what was happening and he encouraged it. He didn't want a republic next door to him. Republics are messy. Republics have elections that can change everything overnight. Alexander wanted stability. He wanted a world where every city followed the same rules forever. He began to merge the two cultures together. He ordered the Roman engineers to build temples to the Greek gods in every city they founded. He ordered the Greek teachers to use Roman laws in their schools. He was creating a single, massive culture that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the mountains of India. But while the empire was becoming more stable, it was also becoming more rigid. There was no room for new ideas. There was no room for rebellion. The entire world was becoming a giant machine designed to serve one man. As Alexander reached his 40th birthday, he looked at his creation. He had done what no human had ever done. He had united the East and the West. He had ended the wars between the city-states. He had brought trade and wealth to places that had been wild for thousands of years. But he was starting to feel the weight of it all. The empire was so big that it took months for a message. To travel from one end to the other, he had to spend all his time reading reports and signing decrees. The conqueror had become a bureaucrat. He missed the sound of the trumpets. He missed the smell of the campfire. He missed the feeling of being on the edge of the unknown. He decided to make one final push. He turned his eyes to the north. Beyond the Rhine River lay the deep, dark forests of the German tribes. His generals begged him to stay in his new capital. They told him the empire was finished. They told him there was nothing in the north but trees and cold wind. Alexander didn't listen. He believed that if the empire stopped growing, it would start dying. He gathered his veterans for one last campaign. But as they marched into the shadows of the northern woods, something was different. The soldiers weren't singing their old war songs. They were silent. The men who had followed him across the world were finally tired. And for the first time in his life, Alexander was about to walk into a trap that he couldn't see. It wasn't a trap set by an enemy. It was a trap set by the very empire he had built. 50 years have passed since Alexander died. The world he left behind is unrecognizable. If you stood on a hill in the middle of Europe at this time, you would see something impossible. In our history, this land was covered in thick, dark forests and small wooden huts. In this world, you see white marble cities rising out of the trees. You see a stone road that stretches for thousands of miles. This is the New World. It is a world where the sun never sets on the Greek language. From the silver mines of Spain to the spice markets of India, everyone speaks the same tongue. A merchant can travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the border of China and never need a translator. They use the same coins with Alexander's face on them. They follow the same laws that were written by the Roman Senate and signed by the great king. This is the greatest era of trade in human history. But it is more than just money. It is a complete change in how humans live. In every city, there is a theater and a library. The local leaders in the north don't call themselves chiefs anymore. They call themselves governors. They wear Greek robes and discuss the philosophy of Plato. They have forgotten the names of their old tribal gods. They pray to Zeus and Apollo, because those are the gods of the empire. The world has become one single, massive culture. The old borders are gone. In our world, Europe spent 1,000 years fighting over small pieces of land. In this world, there is no need to fight. The empire is too big and too strong for anyone to challenge it, but there is a hidden cost to this peace. The world has become very quiet. Because everyone follows the same rules, new ideas have stopped growing. The fierce, independent spirit of the Roman Republic is a distant memory. The wild, creative energy of the Celtic tribes has been smoothed over. Everything is efficient. Everything is organized. But everything is also the same. The architecture is the same in every province. The schools teach the same lessons in every town. The Roman managers keep the records perfectly. The Greek soldiers keep the peace perfectly. It is a world of total order. Alexander's capital, Alexandria on the Rhone, is now the largest city on earth. It is 5 times larger than Rome or Babylon. It is a city of 1 million people. It has giant lighthouses that guide ships from every corner of the sea. It has universities where thousands of students study medicine and math. But if you look closely at the people in the streets, you see something missing. There is no longer a sense of belonging to a home. People are not Macedonians or Romans or Gauls. They are just subjects of the king. They are small parts of a giant machine that never stops moving. This stability has prevented wars, but it has also prevented change. The empire has become a gilded cage. It is beautiful and safe and rich, but there is no way out. The generals who came after Alexander were not conquerors. They were caretakers. They spent their lives making sure the roads were repaired and the taxes were collected. They didn't want to explore new lands. They didn't want to try new ways of governing. They were afraid that if they changed even one small thing, the whole system would break. So the world stayed exactly as Alexander left it. For 50 years, time seemed to stand still. The new world was perfect, but it was frozen. The question was no longer how far the empire could grow. The question was how long it could stay this way before it started to rot from the inside. Because behind the marble walls and the golden statues, a new shadow was beginning to fall. The peace of Alexander was about to face a test that no army could defeat. It was a test that comes for every empire that thinks it has reached the end of history. Imagine a world that never forgot how to read. In our history, the Roman Empire eventually fell apart. The great libraries were burned. The roads were reclaimed by the forest. Europe entered a time we call the Dark Ages. For hundreds of years, the knowledge of the ancient world was mostly lost. But in this world, that collapse never happens. The empire Alexander built is too stable. The Roman managers and the Greek thinkers have created a system that runs itself. It does not depend on one great man anymore. It depends on the law. Because there is only one empire. There are no great wars between nations. Because there is only one language, ideas spread instantly from one side of the continent to the other. The Great Peace lasts for 500 years. Then it lasts for 800 years. Finally, it reaches 1,000 years. Think about what that means for science and technology. In our world, it took us nearly 2,000 years to get back to the level of engineering the Romans had. In this world, the engineers never stopped working. The steam engine is invented in the year 100. The printing press is invented in the year 300. By the time we would be in the middle of the Crusades, this world is already exploring the stars. They are not fighting over religion or borders. They are focused on the next horizon. They are still using the same math that Archimedes taught in the schools of Alexander. But this 1,000-year kingdom has a different face than our world. It is a world without diversity. There are no different countries with different ways of looking at the life. There is only the imperial way. If the emperor decides that a certain branch of science is dangerous, it is erased everywhere. If the government decides a certain book is wrong, it vanishes from every library in the world. The peace is real, but it is heavy. The citizens of this world have never known what it feels like to be free. They have never known what it feels like to choose their own leaders. They are safe, they are fed, and they are educated. But they are also controlled. The great cities of Europe are now thousands of years old. They are made of white stone and gleaming metal. They are beautiful, but they are cold. There is no art that challenges the government. There is no music that calls for revolution. The world has become a giant garden that is perfectly trimmed. In our world, the chaos of the Dark Ages was painful. It was a time of hunger and war. But that chaos also allowed new ideas to grow. It allowed the French, the English, the Germans, and the Italians to create their own unique cultures. It allowed for the birth of modern democracy and the individual. In Alexander's world, those things are never born. The individual does not matter. Only the empire matters. The machine that Alexander started in Babylon has become so big that it has swallowed the human spirit. People in this world look back at the statues of Alexander. They see him as a god who saved them from the darkness of the past. They don't realize that the price of that safety was their own future. They don't realize that they have been living in a beautiful museum for 1,000 years. The Great Peace has lasted longer than any civilization in history, but as the years pass, the empire begins to feel the weight of its own age. The people are starting to wonder if there is anything beyond the marble walls. They are starting to wonder if life was meant to be more than just order and safety. The 1,000-year kingdom is about to face its final challenge. It is not an enemy from the outside. It is the simple fact that nothing can stay the same forever. The world that Alexander built is finally starting to crack. It is easy to look at this world and see a paradise. There is no war, there is no hunger, there is no ignorance. But when we look closer, we start to see what is missing. Every great thing in our world came from struggle. It came from the fact that Europe was divided. Because there were different countries, there were different ideas. If an inventor was kicked out of one kingdom, he could just go to the next one. If a thinker had a dangerous idea in one city, he could find a home in another. In Alexander's world, there is nowhere to go. There is only one kingdom. There is only one set of rules. The competition that drove human progress for 2,000 years simply never happened. Think about the idea of freedom. In our history, the Greeks and the Romans gave us the seeds of democracy. But those seeds only grew because the empires eventually fell. The collapse of the old world allowed people to experiment with new ways of living. It allowed for the birth of the individual. In this world, the individual never really exists. You are a part of the state from the day you are born until the day you die. The government provides your food. The government provides your education. In exchange, the government owns your mind. The idea that a regular person should have a say in how they are ruled was buried in the rubble of the Roman Republic. It never came back. The people of this world don't even have a word for revolution. They can't imagine a world without a king. We also lost the beauty of difference. In our world, the French have their own music and their own way of looking at love. The Germans have their own way of building and their own way of thinking. The Spanish, the Italians, the British, they all have unique souls. In Alexander's world, those souls were never born. The unique languages of the tribes were replaced by a single, perfect version of Greek. The local stories were replaced by the myths of the great king. The world is white, marble, and gold, but it is also a desert of the spirit. There was no Renaissance. There was no Enlightenment. There was no French Revolution. The great shocks that woke humanity up and forced us to grow never occurred. Even the science, as advanced as it is, feels hollow. In our world, we invented things because we had to. We had to find new ways to sail the ocean to find trade. We had to find new ways to fight to stay alive. In this world, there is no had to. The empire is already rich. The empire is already safe. Progress is slow and controlled. It is a world that has traded its soul for safety. It is a world where no one ever has to worry about the future, but no one ever dreams of a better one. Alexander wanted to unite the world to save it from chaos. He succeeded. But in killing the chaos, he also killed the spark that makes us human. We look at our own history and see a map covered in blood. We see centuries of war and pain. We see the ruins of empires that failed. But in those ruins, we found the room to breathe. In that blood, we found the courage to ask why. Alexander's world never asks why. It only asks, what are the orders? The man who conquered the world built a cage so perfect that no one even knows they are inside it. We are coming to the end of our story. The great peace is finally beginning to tremble, not because of an invasion, but because a human heart cannot live on bread and order alone. The final lessons of the European Empire are waiting for us. So, what did we learn from the story of the man who refused to die in Babylon? What did we learn from the world that traded its freedom for 1,000 years of peace? The first lesson is that stability is not the same thing as progress. We often think that if we could just stop the wars and the arguments, the world would become a perfect place. But Alexander's empire shows us that perfection is a dead end. When you have total order, you have no room for the unexpected. When every road is paved and every law is set in stone, there is no reason to look for a better way. Human beings need a little bit of chaos to stay sharp. We need the struggle to remind us why we are moving forward. The second lesson is that our differences are actually our greatest strength. In our history, the fact that Europe was a mess of different tribes and languages was often a tragedy. It led to centuries of fighting and blood. But it also led to a massive explosion of different ideas. Because there were many different cultures, there were many different ways to solve a problem. If one country failed, another could succeed. In Alexander's world, there was only one culture. When that culture finally ran out of new things to say, the whole world stopped talking. Unity is a beautiful goal, but it can also be a prison. The third lesson is that one man should never be allowed to decide the future for everyone else. Alexander was a genius. He was perhaps the most brilliant military mind to ever live. He built a world that was safer and richer than anything that came before it. But he built it in his own image. He decided what people should learn and what gods they should pray to. And because he was so successful, no one ever dared to question him. An empire that depends on the vision of one person will always be limited by that person's imagination. The final lesson is about the cost of safety. We all want to live in a world where we are protected. We want to know that our homes are safe, our children will be fed. Alexander gave the people of Europe everything they thought they wanted. He gave them peace. He gave them wealth. He gave them 1,000 years of stability. But in exchange, he took away their ability to choose their own path. He took away the chance for the world to grow in its own messy, unpredictable way. In our history, the fall of the Roman Empire was a disaster that led to the Dark Ages. But it was also a reset button. It cleared the ground so that new things could grow. It allowed the modern world to be born. Alexander's empire never allowed the modern world to happen. It stayed in a golden yesterday forever. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. We will never know if Alexander could have really conquered the West. But by looking at what might have happened, we learn to appreciate the world we actually have. We learn that the chaos and the divisions of our own history were the very things that made us who we are today. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in our world. And in a strange way, that might have been his greatest gift to the future.